So this week I had to wage war on an old enemy that I didn't even know that I had or had forgotten that I had had. And Ben came up to me last Saturday morning, a week ago Saturday, and he told me about this enemy that was living outside my house. And so there were some nasty, big, yellow jacket type bees. They had formed a soccer-sized nest in the tree on our side yard, and it overhung the sidewalk. It was about 5 feet off the ground in the middle of the sidewalk. And I was like, what do we do about this? I thought of several ways that I could wage war upon these nasty vipers. And so I thought of this one thing. I thought, I'm going to take a trash can. I'm going to place it right under there. It would only be a couple feet, right? And I'm going to clip that branch and let it fall in there and hurry up and put the lid on. And then I thought, there's a lot of things that could go wrong. So I scrapped that. So we didn't have the chance to do anything that Saturday, and so it was a long, long day. And so Sunday after church, we went to ShopRite, and they only had this spray. This isn't it. This is just a prop. But they had this environmentally safe hornet spray, and so we got it. We got the only thing that they had. It's the only thing that they had. They only had 2 bottles, so we got it. And we went home, and that night, I got ready. I got ready for war. I put a hoodie on. I figured I'm going to have every bit of skin covered that I possibly can, because I've gotten bit as a kid, as a teenager. Man, I got bit so many times on the farm, and I didn't want this to happen again. But I was waging war. They were not going to defeat me. My son was like, "Are you really going to eradicate a whole family of bees?" And I said, "Son, it's them or us." So I went out there. I was ready. I had shoes on. I had everything. I was ready. And I thought about putting war paint on, but I didn't. And I shook it up because it said, man, you got to shake it up. You got to wait till it's, after the sun goes down. And so I did. And it seemed real peaceful. And I took that and I aimed it at that hole in there, because it said spray it for like 15 seconds in the entrance. He said, be careful, because they could have more than one entrance, or there could be bees on the hive. So you got to be careful. So I pushed the trigger, and it sprayed for like 3 seconds, and it sputtered and it stopped. And I did what any good warrior would do. I ran inside. But I wasn't going to be defeated. The next morning, I got up at 5 a.m. and I took that can back out there and I aimed it at that hole. There was quiet because I had stirred them up. Whenever I sprayed it in there for a couple seconds, they were everywhere, and I was so scared like they were going to attack people on the street and stuff. So I was concerned. So I got up at 5 a.m. and I go out there and I aim it at that hole again, and I spray and I spray and I spray the whole can in that nest. And again, like, they were everywhere. It killed a lot, but it didn't kill all of them. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, now what do I do? So we ordered online. This was Monday. We ordered online this other stuff, some ortho. And we thought, we got to get some more potent stuff. So it was coming on Tuesday, but I still had another can of this other stuff. So Monday night I went out there and I sprayed it again and again everywhere. And I'm really concerned because they're not, all of them are not dying. But I was not going to lose. So when that other can came the next day, I waited till dusk. And they were still in that high, but they were building another one about 4 feet above. They were determined, but so was I. So I took that new, more lethal stuff and I sprayed it. And I'm telling you, it was like that expanding foam. When it hit that branch, it just kept expanding. It enveloped the whole branch. And those bees are done. And some of us in here this morning, we need to wage war on a different enemy. And that enemy is unforgiveness. All of us, but not necessarily equally, have suffered an experience of injustice in our lives. That means we have either forgiven someone that has hurt us, oppressed us, or we are still harboring bitterness or a grudge against someone that has hurt us, someone that has abused us, someone that's an adulterer, or someone that's abandoned us or manipulated us or whatever. This is a conclusion of our justice series this morning, and I hope that you have learned a lot about biblical justice. I even hope that you've maybe grown in your appreciation for the Justice League. I've enjoyed getting into that movie and applying it to this. But this story we're going to talk about today is with Jesus. I hope that it will make you smile. It should make you smile. So smile. All right, good. That's a start. It comes from Matthew chapter 9. And Jesus calls Matthew from his tax business to the ministry. Now, Matthew is a tax collector. He is one of the oppressors in this, just one of the oppressors in this story. Now, I don't want to exaggerate and make Matthew as some type of human trafficker. He's not that bad if we're going to quantify or qualify badness. But he is a bad dude in this story. And at this time in the first century, he was the worst type of tax collector there was. There was two different types of tax collectors. One, he had restraints on him. He collected what they were told to collect. That was income tax, 10%. Everybody paid the same. But Matthew was the type of tax collector who collected fees and tolls and the license that you needed, the money to pay for licenses and stuff like that. He collected that, and he could charge whatever he wanted. He could charge you less and charge me more. There were no restraints. And so he was despised more than any other. In this time in the first century, he was the type of person that was unworthy. Any time, because he was a Jew, a tax collector for the Romans, he was considered even a traitor to his country. The Romans were oppressors in this story as well. You don't see them, but he is collecting taxes for them and for himself. There was a lot of greed that went into Matthew's decisions. The tax collector did the dirty work for the oppressor, but he was rewarded very handsomely for it. So the worst of the worst people in this time in Israel is Matthew. Tax collectors were not even allowed to go to the Jewish gatherings, the festivals, and the celebrations. Matthew is viewed as unclean, unworthy, unfit for Jewish society. So Matthew to the Jews is kind of like Lex Luthor to Superman. You know him. Or like the Joker to Batman. And the unworthy, the evil, the arch enemy. And so let's look at this passage. Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. It says, and Jesus passed on from there. He saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, follow me. And he rose and he followed him. And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with the tax collectors and sinners? But when he heard it, he said, those who are well have no need for a physician, but those who are sick. Now go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. So from this, I want to look at 3 ways that Jesus shows mercy and forgiveness in this world and how we should too. First one is Jesus mercifully seeks out the oppressor to mercifully save. I use that idea of mercy because he quotes here in verse number 13, he quotes, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And if you remember from last week, he's quoting Hosea 6:6. And so this is all about mercy. When Jesus commands Matthew to follow him, his disciples probably said, what are you thinking? This is our arch enemy. Are you serious? And this tax collector would have been viewed as the oppressor, that he is allowing in the Lex Luthor, the Joker. It says in verse 9, it says, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, follow me. And he arose and he followed him. In this story, there's no doubt who Matthew is. He's the enemy, he's the oppressor. But keep in mind that Matthew is writing this himself. He's writing this by the inspiration of God, but he is writing this about himself. If you go to the other 2 Gospels that has the same story, in Mark and Luke, you see that they use a different name for him, Levi. It's the lesser known way to refer to him. But Matthew just flat out says, I'm Matthew the tax collector. But he is considered one of the most unworthy people in Israel at this time, and no more despised than any other man. He was more despised than any other man. Probably the only one that was despised more was the emperor. So someone once said this about Christianity. He said, it is the only movement in the world that the number one characteristic for membership is unworthiness. Unworthiness. Jesus shows him mercy, seeing him and calling him to be mercifully saved. Jesus took time to go his way. Remember, Jesus didn't do anything that he didn't do purposefully. He did everything that his Father told him to do. He went everywhere that his Father wanted him to go. He said everything that his Father wanted him to say. Matthew is a despised villain in this story, but yet Jesus gives him an opportunity to live for him, to change. He gives him a chance to be forgiven. This is very similar to Lex Luthor and the Joker. If they would turn and they would join the Justice League, you say, no way. Batman, Superman, they would not allow that to happen. Right, because why? Because they wouldn't be trusted. Even if they would be doing it for the purpose of doing more evil. And to get into a place where they could cause more damage. Well, how could you trust Lex Luthor or the Joker? So how could you trust Matthew? So I hope this relates to all of us, because we are all unworthy. We all have been called to follow despite our unworthiness. In fact, the other villains in this story, the other oppressors, the Pharisees, they thought that they were worthy. So maybe you're here this morning, you're thinking, I'm not that bad. I'm pretty worthy. And we're not. We're not. And Matthew was different than the rest of the disciples, because Matthew, when he turned away from his business, the tax business, and he turned to Christ, he burned the bridge that he had back to that. Now, if Peter, Andrew, James, or John wanted to not follow Jesus anymore, they could go back to the boat. They could fish again. Matthew couldn't go back to tax collecting. It's really hard sometimes to forgive those that have hurt us the most. And it hurts. I don't want to downplay that. I don't want to downplay the hurts that you have received, that it doesn't have a big difference in your life. But we see Jesus giving mercy. So we're to give mercy. One of the main points that Jesus has for this story here is for us to give mercy to people in life that have hurt us, that have oppressed us. Are you willing to give mercy? Are you? Are you willing to pray for your abuser or your oppressor? Are you willing to desire that they mercifully receive salvation before it's too late? So the first point is that we seek out our oppressor to show mercy. The next point is Jesus mercifully saves the oppressor that responds to follow. It is really awesome what Jesus does here in calling Matthew from this tax business to ministry. Look at verses 9 and 10. And Jesus passed on from there, and he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and he followed him. And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. We see here that Matthew responds to this call with immediate action, and he follows Jesus. Luke actually says that he dropped everything, basically, and to follow Jesus. No delay. Luke 5:27-28 says, and after this he went out and he saw the tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And leaving everything, he rose and he followed him. Matthew left behind a significant financial fortune in order to gain an unquantifiable spiritual fortune. So what I have here this morning is trying to illustrate this is that I have a list of my sins. I really believe that we can be fully known and fully loved. And yesterday I saw this illustration in a sermon that I watched last week. And so I've tweaked it to go with this message today about forgiveness. But this is a list, and I just sat down for an hour or so, and I just started listing out the things that I could think of, that the sins that I had committed throughout my life. And again, There's not everything on here, obviously. And there's probably some things that are more safe than others and things that I didn't put on here because I don't think you're ready to hear them. But I lied to get out of work when I was a kid. Not all the time, but every now and then. It was just like on the farm, we were working all the time. Morning before we went to school, at night before when I came home from school, Saturdays, Sunday afternoons. I mean, we worked all the time. So I faked sick sometimes. I stole from stores. I stole from my parents. Mainly when I was a teenager, I was as skinny as a rail, and I could eat so much food, and I would go to school and I would eat a double lunch, but my mom would only pay for the one lunch, so I had to steal the money for the other lunch. Not proud of that. Stupid. I complained about my parents. I made fun of the new kid at school, and he nearly beat the tar out of me. If it wasn't for his friends, he would have. I was bitter for having to go to church as a kid. I pretended to go to church, but I didn't. When I was old enough, my friends they would come pick me up, and we would pretend like we were going to church, to another church, and then we wouldn't. I was ashamed of my parents because we lived on a farm, angry about working on the farm all the time. I fought with my siblings. I said mean things at my siblings. I'm prideful, thought evil thoughts, loved myself more than God. I drank alcohol as a teenager, and as a teenager I smoked cigarettes and cigars. I've gotten drunk, I've gotten high. I've sought independence from God. I've laughed at coarse joking. I've said really coarse joking myself. I've had lustful thoughts, more than I can think of. I've eaten too much. When I was a new Christian, I stayed home from church. There's been periods of time in my life as a Christian I didn't read my Bible for days. There's been periods of time where I didn't pray or commune with God. Premarital sex, shamefully hid my abuse, the abuse done to me. I've cheated on tests. I've helped others cheat. I've lied about cheating on tests. A bunch of us were cheating on this test in high school, and we got caught. And I tried to lie my way out of it. That didn't even work. I went to an R-rated movie when I was age 15. Then I had to lie about it because we got kicked out of the movie because I wasn't old enough. And so I had to lie to my parents. What was the movie? Oh, it was great. E.T. was so cool. Not witnessing to the lost. Was ashamed of my faith. Stayed silent about others' sin. Lied about my mistakes at work. Speeding, I had to pay tickets. Angry towards my kid, my wife Karen. Stole from an employer. Hated my neighbor. Stayed silent about the gospel with my neighbor. Angry at my dad. Lied about going to the movie Friday the 13th. My mom said, "Don't go to that movie. That's not good for you." But I went anyway. The next day I was driving a nail. I was helping my dad. We're adding on to our barn. I was driving a nail. A piece of that nail flew out and hit me in the eye. Spent 4 days in the hospital. Had to have it extracted. It was the middle of baseball season in my senior year. Baseball was my God at that time in my life. It really was a bad choice. I've watched pornography. I've been lazy at work. I've been late for work and lied about it. Thought of hurting people. It just goes on and on. You know, a lot of times we don't have a problem with thinking that Jesus can pay for our sins. In reality, what Jesus did is he clothed himself. He wore wore my sin. He wore your sin. And he paid for all of that. And there's some space here and here. I didn't, it's not like these are just the only sins that I committed. It could keep going. And it could keep going because he keeps on, that was paid for all of my sins for the rest of my life. So that list is not done. And he's paid for it all. He wore it. He wore my sin on the cross. So this command to follow Jesus, if we're not willing, to follow Jesus, we said, okay, take all of my sin. I want to live for you. I believe that you died on the cross for my sins. I want you to take all of my sin. Sometimes we're like, we'll take that, but then we'll hold on to other people's sin because it's hurt us. Following Jesus means we're going to be like Jesus. It means that we want to do what he did. What did he do? He forgave us. And we're not going to forgive others. We're not going to show mercy to others. It don't seem right. Secondly, salvation is contingent that we turn away from our sin and we turn to God for salvation. That's what Matthew did. He turned away from his sin. He turned to Jesus for salvation. It's called repentance. One of the greatest ways that we people can tell that we're Christians is by the mercy and forgiveness we have for others. So it is so merciful that God would even draw us to the mental capacity to be able to understand that what Jesus has done for us and then articulate it back to him to be saved. So have you come to the conclusion that you cannot save yourself? Have you come to the conclusion that you need God to save you? You see, the other villains in this story, the Pharisees, they did not come to that conclusion yet. I hope that you have come to that conclusion this morning. And then in a moment in this service, I hope that you pray and receive him. Are you willing to turn to Jesus and allow him to take your life and give you a new life? If you're a Christian already here this morning, are you willing to see your oppressor, the person that has hurt you the most? Are you willing to see them the way God sees them? So first we seek out the oppressor to show mercy. Then we see the oppressor the way Jesus sees them. And lastly, Jesus mercifully forgives us, so we will mercifully forgive others. Jesus has a point for giving us mercy. We receive mercy to give mercy to others. We are forgiven to forgive others. Matthew 9, 11, and 13, it says that when the Pharisees saw this, they said to the disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" This oppressor in this story, they didn't even have the boldness to go to Jesus. They went behind his back to his disciples. But he knew. And he said this. He said, "Those who are well have no need for a physician, but those who are sick." So in other words, you have to know that you need Jesus before you can accept him as your Savior. You got to know that you're a sinner. You got to know that this has disqualified you and separated you from God for all of eternity before you can come to Jesus. Goes on, he says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but the sinner. That idea of righteous, he's not talking about being right with God. He's talking about the Pharisee being in his mind, he is right based on who he is, what he does, not what Jesus did. The Pharisee didn't need Jesus. So the Pharisee, all he wanted to do is criticize, condemn, and cancel. So sometimes, I'm speaking for myself. Sometimes it's easier to forgive than others. I don't know if any of my kids are here. I don't think they are. But it was pretty easy after I got over the initial shock to forgive my kids for having a party in our house when we weren't there. After I got over that, they're my kids, right? So many times I said, you know what? Yeah, Jesus paid for that sin. I'm going to let go of that. No, there were other times where it gets a little more complicated. It gets a little deeper. There was a time that I was passed on a promotion at work when I worked in construction. And I got bitter for many weeks. But eventually I said, you know what? It's God's will, not mine. If he wanted me to have that promotion, I would have gotten it. I'm gonna put that under his blood. And then, there was about 7 years ago, this church was going through a transition. Our pastor was leaving, and church was getting prepared to vote on us, on if I would be the pastor of this church. And there were some people that opposed us, and they gossiped and attacked us behind our backs and said things that weren't true about us. And because of the place I was in and dependence upon God, that was fairly easy to forgive. Although it hurt deeply, it was still, I could give it. And there was times where I kind of gave it to God, but I took it back. But then I eventually said, you know what? I don't need that weight on me. But then there was, whenever I was 9, and my foster brother sexually abused me. That I held on to. I cannot forgive that. After I was saved, over time, it just kind of, just didn't think about it, right? But after I was saved, and I was going through Regen and thought about it, what has this caused in my life? And I was really able to let go of it and give it to God, even though it hurt so deep. And still hurts, but I can say that it's underneath the blood of Jesus. So, are you willing to stop criticizing the person that hurts you, to stop condemning them, stop canceling them? Cancel culture is such a horrible thing. It goes completely against the gospel. Jason Aldean song, Try That in a Small Town, being canceled. He's being canceled. Why? Because he's talking about life in a small town. There's no ill intent there. It's hey, we defend ourselves. But yet, the cancel culture in this world, in the United States, goes completely against the gospel. Are you willing to not cancel that person and be like Jesus, follow him and let go of it. There's a song by Phil Wickham. It's called The Jesus Way. And it really talks about this. And if you hurt me, I'm going to forgive you. And it goes through a long list of things like, this is the Jesus way. He says, I'll follow the Jesus way. I follow Jesus. I follow Jesus. The Jesus way is to show mercy. The Jesus way is to forgive, even though it can be so devastating and hurting. We have to reject those thoughts that lead to criticism, cancellation, condemnation. We have to refuse to condemn, cancel, and we need to forgive instead. We need to follow Jesus. Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to stop criticizing that person and forgive them? Put it on the cross where it belongs. It's paid for. If they choose to allow it, it's paid for. Are you willing to let go of it? Are you willing to uncancel and to bless instead? There's a passage I want to read. Luke chapter 6. Verse 27 and 36, it says this. It says, "But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you." This is Jesus speaking. Love your enemy. Do good to those that hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. To the one who strikes you on the cheek, offer to the other also. And from the one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic also. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do to them. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? And even if sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to the one from whom you expect to receive, what credit is it to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to get back the same amount. But love your enemies. But love your enemies and do good and lend and expect nothing in return, and your reward will be great. And you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and to the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. So this morning, as we conclude this message, we seek out the oppressor to show mercy. We see the oppressor the way Jesus sees them. And lastly, we give rather than criticize. We give mercy rather than criticize, rather than condemning, and rather than canceling. Let's go back to that hornet's nest. I had to wage war on an enemy. And all of us need to wage war on the greatest enemy in our lives, and that's unforgiveness. It's pretty amazing that the enemy, the devil, would take something as simple as we have been forgiven to forgive, and he would turn that around, and for us, one of the greatest ways that we can follow Jesus, and he would make it almost impossible, that we are almost paralyzed and not be able to let go. We have an enemy, and we need to fight against that enemy. That enemy comes in the form of unforgiveness from the enemy, the devil. And we need to fight against it. We need to do, like I was willing to do anything necessary to get that harm out of my life, off my sidewalk. We need to do anything that's possible within the Word of God to fight against the bitterness that can crop up in our lives and cause us to be disqualified, to be brought to nothing, because we won't follow Jesus in this simple way. So this morning, I just want to challenge you. Is there somebody you need to forgive? There's somebody that's hurt you deeply. Are you willing to pray for them? Are you willing to see them the way Jesus sees them? We see here that he sees the oppressor. He loves them, and he wants to give them an opportunity to follow him. Are you willing to pray for them so that they can turn to Jesus and be saved? Are you willing to stop complaining, stop talking about them, criticizing them? And I know, man, it's probably second nature. Are you willing to put that away and start desiring for them to be saved?